This wasn't just another heated exchange on Capitol Hill. This was the day Senator Michael Bennet hit his breaking point. In a hearing packed with cameras, he accused Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent of something you almost never hear spoken so plainly in these halls: lying. And not about a small misstep, but about the core of an economic plan Bennett says will strip health care from millions, slash food assistance for struggling families, and shovel massive tax cuts to the wealthiest Americans, all while piling trillions more onto the national debt. The moment was explosive, but what made it go viral wasn't just the volume in Bennett's voice. It was the numbers, the history, and the stakes behind them. Bennett's frustration had been building for months.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for coming in today, and thanks for having this hearing. Secretary Bessent, the last time you were here, I asked you about your emphasis on domestic discretionary funding in your opening statement. You had stated, quote, "We must adjust federal domestic discretionary spending to get our fiscal house in order while striking an urgent tone on our growing deficit." I mentioned to you then that domestic discretionary spending is only 15% of our budget. And I think if you were serious about deficit reduction, you might not push for tax cuts that almost certainly could not be offset by discretionary adjustments alone. And now, of course, we know you can't. Today, we actually have the details of your plan. Take health care from 10 million Americans, 126,000 Coloradans, cut nutrition assistance for millions of adults, sunset clean energy investments that are so critical to the American West, give over 40% of the tax benefits of this bill to the top 5%. And it's not even close to being paid for. Even my colleagues on the Republican side, who for years and years and years have claimed to be the fiscally responsible party, now are admitting that it's not paid for. This bill adds another $2.4 trillion to our national debt. It will push the deficit to GDP ratio up to 7%, which you said when you were here before was unsustainable, far from the 3% target that you described. If you look at your proposals taken together, there is no getting around the fact. There is no getting around the fact that the richest Americans receive an average tax cut of $300,000, which, again, we're not paying for with the discretionary cuts that you advertise. So once again, we will have to borrow money in order to assist the people in this country who least need a tax cut at this moment, while the Americans who have been made miserable by the economy that they're in actually see income reduced because of cuts to Medicaid and cuts to SNAP. Meanwhile, and I think, Mr. Chairman, this is really important, meanwhile, interest rates are at 20-year highs. Moody's has slashed our credit rating because of the fiscal irresponsibility of this administration. The World Bank has cut our growth estimates in half, and the bond markets are screaming at us to stop. We now pay, and we are paying this year, more in interest than we are in the national defense. Secretary Bessent, how can you square your concern with fiscal health with deficit finance growth for families that need those tax cuts least?
Senator, I'll begin with that we did not get here. We inherited this fiscal situation that I believe.
Well, you inherited from Donald Trump, who was here. You did, Mr. Bessent.
No,
yes,
sir.
you did, Mr. Bessent. You inherited from Donald Trump. He's the first president to come back after a 4-year hiatus, after we know exactly what the last tax cuts did, which was blow a massive hole in our deficit and debt. You can't sit here and lie about that. It's true. The data, to coin a phrase, the data shows that that's the result. The math shows that that is the result. No one on this side of the aisle admits anymore that or claims anymore that they didn't blow a huge hole in the deficit. They did. And now you're here saying to the American people, let's double down on that. We're going to give tax cuts for the wealthy. We are going to give tax cuts again to the wealthiest people in America, and we are going to finance it on the backs of the sons and daughters of teachers and firefighters and police officers all over this country, because we can't pay for it. Because the Treasury Secretary discovered somehow that domestic discretionary spending is only 15% of the budget, and therefore you can't balance it there.
Well, sir, we had a referendum on November 5th.
You certainly did. I agree with
policies. Your side lost.
I agree with that.
And a higher decibel
and
level.
I'm a rare Democrat who doesn't blame Donald Trump for winning. I'm sad he won. I don't blame him for winning. But don't come here.
In your statements,
go ahead.
They have veracity.
Go ahead, Mr. Secretary. What?
Higher decibel level does not give your statements more veracity.
My statements are true, if that's the word, if that's what you mean by veracity. My statements are true. You blew a massive hole in the deficit when your predecessor was sitting here under Donald Trump. And so the question is, can't we think of something better to do with the money than this debt, than drive up interest rates by borrowing money from our kids so the richest people in America can get a tax cut when they don't need it? That is the reality of your plan.
Well, sir, actually the high interest rates were achieved during the Biden administration in October of 2023, and we have not touched those rates since then. So
the higher interest rates.
No, your statement's incorrect.
I'm out of time, and I appreciate the indulgence of the chairman.
Thank you, Senator.
In their previous encounter, Bessent leaned hard on a familiar talking point, that the way to get America's fiscal house in order was to cut domestic discretionary spending. It sounds serious, maybe even decisive, until you realize, as Bennett reminded everyone, that domestic discretionary spending makes up only 15% of the federal budget. You could slash it to the bone and still barely touch the deficit. That's why Bennett bristled. Cutting that slice while handing out giant tax cuts was like trying to plug a dam with a Band-Aid, while opening a new hole just below the waterline. Then the details of Bessent's plan dropped, and the picture came into sharp focus. It would take health coverage from 10 million Americans, including more than 126,000 in Bennett's home state of Colorado. It would gut nutrition assistance for millions of adults who rely on it to feed their families. It would sunset clean energy investments that are critical to the economy of the American West. And here's where Bennett's outrage hit another gear. Over 40% of the tax benefits would go to the top 5% of earners, with the richest Americans walking away with an average tax cut of about $300,000. To Bennett, it wasn't just unfair, it was irresponsible, because these cuts aren't even paid for. Bennett hammered the point that the plan would add $2.44 trillion to the national debt and push the deficit to GDP ratio up to 7%, a level Bessent himself had previously called unsustainable. Far from the 3% target he once promoted, this plan, Bennett argued, was doubling down on the exact same strategy that had already failed. He pointed to the Trump-era tax cuts, which skewed toward the wealthy and blew a massive hole in the budget. Even many Republicans had quietly stopped pretending they paid for themselves. And yet, here was another round of the same, financed by cuts to the very programs that keep working families above water. That IT wasn't just about the spreadsheets. The broader economic picture, Bennett said, was flashing warning lights. Interest rates are at 20-year highs. Moody's has downgraded America's credit rating. The World Bank has slashed U.S. growth forecasts in half. The bond markets, the very lenders financing America's debt, are sending a clear message to stop making the problem worse. This year alone, the United States will spend more on interest payments than on the entire national defense budget. That's not just a talking point. That's a shift in the way our government spends its money, with long-term consequences for every household in the country. The exchange in the hearing room turned sharp. Bennett accused Bessent of inheriting the fiscal mess from Donald Trump, a president who returned after a 4-year break and whose last round of tax cuts had already drained federal coffers. Bessent tried to push back, saying the high interest rates were a product of the Biden administration, not his policies. But Bennett was relentless. "You can't," he said, "borrow money from our children so the richest people in America can have a bigger yacht or another vacation home. That's not fiscal responsibility, it's a choice. And it's the wrong one." The political temperature spiked even higher when Bennett pointed out that this wasn't just Democrats criticizing the plan. For years, Republicans had branded themselves as the fiscally responsible party. Now, even some of them were admitting that this plan doesn't pay for itself. It would force the government to borrow, to spend more on interest, and to deepen the debt, while asking working families to take the hit in reduced services and support. That's why, Bennett said, "You can't sit here and lie about it. The math is the math. Strip away the politics. And what's left is a question every American has a stake in. Who benefits when we rewrite the tax code? And who ends up footing the bill?" Bennett framed it as a test of national priorities. Do we use our resources to make sure millionaires and billionaires get another windfall? Or do we invest in things that strengthen the country from the middle out? Healthcare, education, infrastructure, clean energy? Because, as he sees it, that's where real economic growth comes from, not from trickle-down promises that have failed before. And make no mistake, Bennett's pushback wasn't just an ideological fight. It was grounded in hard, recent history. He's watched what happened when similar policies were tried in the past. He's seen the hole it left in the budget, the pressure it put on programs ordinary Americans depend on, and the way it forced borrowing that future generations will have to pay back. The bond markets aren't bluffing. The credit rating agencies aren't making noise for fun. When the people who hold America's debt start doubting its fiscal discipline, it hits every part of the economy, from mortgage rates to the cost of doing business. That's why this hearing resonated far beyond the walls of the committee room. It wasn't just a clash of personalities or political theater. It was a moment when one lawmaker tried to strip away the polished talking points and say plainly, "Here's what this plan will do, here's who it will help, and here's who will get left behind." The cameras caught the frustration, but the real story was in the facts laid out in the record. If you care about where this country is headed, moments like this matter. They show us that the fights over budget lines and policy language aren't abstract. They decide whether a family can afford health care, whether a child goes to bed hungry, whether the next generation inherits a stronger country or a heavier burden of debt. And the uncomfortable truth is that the choices being made now will shape the world your family lives in decades from now. So ask yourself, are we making those choices for the benefit of a few or for the future of everyone? Because in the end, it's not about which party wins the debate. It's about whether the people who sent these lawmakers to Washington get a government that works for them. If you want to see more breakdowns that cut through the noise and show what's really at stake, hit subscribe and drop your thoughts below. Do you think Bennett is right about this plan being a giveaway to the wealthy? Or do you believe it's the right move for growth? I'm curious to see where you stand.